really kind introduction. And I want to reiterate, this really is a homecoming for me. It's so nice to be here and feel welcomed into the digital humanities community here, which was really only, I guess, 2010, right, was when you had that first conversation, and I defended in 2011. So it was really only beginning as I left, and so it feels really nice to feel like I've been embraced after the fact. And I think it's really nice to speak here at CUNY because I think, on a more conceptual level, sort of these ideas about openness and access and ideas about privilege that I think have only recently sort of become central to digital humanities conversations. I think to people in this room, we learn these things and experience these things every day as a result of our teaching here and our education here, and I feel like it helps to constitute a really special group of scholars. So I'm happy to be here to contribute to that. So let's see, so my starting premise for this talk and also for this project as a whole is that we live in sort of a golden age of data visualization. So to take an example that's been all over the news in the past few weeks, healthcare. You can look here and find examples of visualizations from the most basic to the most sophisticated. So this is Hans Rosling, who's like a TED Talk wunderkind. He does this like live action physical manipulation of healthcare statistics in a room, on a slide, things like that. So that's an example of one end of the spectrum. The other, this is from last week. This is a chart that was given of the Obamacare enrollment on Fox News, which this was April 1st, the day after the deadline closed, and they were taken to task that day for willfully misleading people with the scale of their chart, and they were forced to recant and correct the scale a day later, revealing a much closer to expected goal than they would like to believe. So anyway, what I want to do today, most generally, first through just a couple more contemporary examples, and then through a more formal account, is to document and then really question this sort of golden age of data visualization. And so what I want to do is to underscore how data visualization is never neutral, right? This is a dramatic account, but really in almost every image, the form is conceived within a particular framework, within its own history and context, and in order to encourage a particular perspective on or view of the data. And I want to show how this view can be political, it can advance an argument, and then I'll claim, and this is true of the larger project, that this feature of data visualization hasn't just recently emerged. Instead, it's been true of the visual display of quantitative information since its first instantiations in the 18th century, and actually, arguably, even before. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and I'm going to move from the present back to the historical, and then discuss some of my own applications of data visualization techniques. And then I'm going to turn to some of the newer work on sort of in the software studies vein that I've been thinking about recently, and I hope this will give you enough time to ask questions and also to offer your own ideas. So this golden age of data. I'm going to begin with an example that seems to me sort of emblematic of our times, and I choose it because it's like about a person like you or me, but also because it's a little bit extreme. This is Nick Felton's annual reports. He's a 30-something Brooklynite. He tends towards sort of like the nerdy side of the hipster spectrum. And since 2005, he's been publishing these beautiful books in which he visualizes the data that he's gathered about himself in the past year. So they're issued in print form, so you can actually purchase them and hold them in your hands, but there's also an accompanying website, which is worth checking out. So this is an early image from 2006. It's sort of a year in one view, and you can see a sobering representation of his vacation days, not many, along with the number of plants he's killed, 4 right there, and also the date his first gray hair was discovered, June 20th of that year. So by contrast, here's an image from the most recent report, and this data was generated with a custom-built iPhone app that messaged him at random intervals throughout the day, asking for answers to a series of questions. These include, where are you? Are you working? What are you doing? Who are you with? And I think that's it. But compared to the earlier image, you can see a shift from an infographic style of visualization, as sort of this year-in-one view, with an implied narrative and an audience in mind, to a more data-driven account of his 2013. So I'd argue that the shift in form coincides with the coalescing of a common vocabulary of visual modes, at least for certain socioeconomic groups. So like line graphs, bar charts, scatter plots. Thanks to software like Excel, we know what these are and how to read them. And with Felton, we also see evidence of a trend in the development of a more sophisticated tool set for data collection and visualization. So his iPhone app is an extreme case, right? But just think of Fitbit or something like that. Or here, for instance, is a website that he made, datum.com, which is his own attempt to make personal data collection more accessible. And with everyone talking big data, we're just seeing more and more of this, right? Tools for collecting data and forms for visualizing it. But the impulse towards the visual display of this information, it came from somewhere. And so what I want to do today is show how charts like Felton's, in their earliest instantiations and also in the present, how they're all deliberately constructed, designed to encourage a specific perspective on the underlying data. And in this case, both in the data collected and in the way it's presented, we see Felton's understanding of the factors that characterize a year of his life. So here's a second example of a visualization that not only encourages a particular perspective on the underlying data, but also politicizes that data through its display. This is a website called They Rule. It's actually interactive, but I won't demo it now. It allows you to navigate through the social network that connects the board members of the top 1,000 companies in the United States. So this is a screen capture, and I just selected Apple fairly arbitrarily because I have their products. And I click to expand the board members' other connections, and you can see there's Nike, Chevron, Amgen, General Electric, Walt Disney. It shows the social network. It really is a social network of these board members in the US. And it also demonstrates a basic tenet of the visual display of data, right? How the form of an image achieves its strongest force when it coincides with the argument that the designers want to make. So in this case, that everyone is connected, or as they put it, they rule. I'm going to try to just breeze through the next two examples in order to establish a couple more significant functions of data visualization at the present moment. And I'm not going to discuss them in depth right now, but I'd be happy to talk about them later. The first is visualization as art. And this is a simple yet really beautiful and evocative example of an aestheticized visualization. This is Fernando Viegas and Martin Wattenberg's wind map. And this is also, it moves if you go to hintfm/wind, you'll see it sort of swirls around. This visualizes in real time the surface patterns of the surface wind patterns across the United States. And on the project's page, they have a note to readers, quote, looking for a weather map or who just want more detail on the weather today, to consult wonderground.com. And so it sort of begs the question, right, if this isn't a traditional wind map and you're cautioned not to use it to fly a plane, sail a boat, or fight wildfires, like what kind of map is this beautiful thing and what function does it perform? And one more contemporary example before we move back in time. Here's an example that sort of cuts across the political and the aesthetic and enters into the range of the physical. This is the Swamp Collective Spore 1.1. And it's sort of part of a trend of what I'm calling pervasive viz, or visualizations that exist in the physical world. So Spore consists of a rubber tree plant at the top and then a watering mechanism at the bottom. And the watering mechanism is activated by the stock price of Home Depot. It turns out both the rubber tree plant and the parts for its construction were purchased there. So if Home Depot's stock does well, the plant flourishes. And if the stock does poorly, then it withers and dies. So you have a manifestation of data in the not merely physical, but specifically its biological world, right? And it's a little bit hard to determine the scale, and it would probably fail the Edward Tufte test. But I feel like it's important to consider these types of visualizations, these types of displays, because I think as devices, again, like Fitbit, like Google Glass, as the techniques like 3D printing, as these physical computing representations, as they become more widespread, we're just going to see more and more manifestations of data and representations of data in the physical as well as the digital world. So I think I just want to pause here and talk a little bit about the idea of representation, because I think as a concept, it's sort of solidly 1990s.
And I feel like since scholars have proposed a real range of alternative concepts for supplementing the idea, so ideas about mediation, enactment, and even visualization itself. I feel like in spite of all this, it can't really be emphasized enough that all visualizations are representations. And even the most seemingly objective statistical modes of display, they presuppose something. So if not a referent, then an assumed mode of encountering the image, a mode of observation which is embedded in a particular context or a discipline. And I make a point of this in order to counter the common perception that visualization reveals data. And this is how Edward Tufte defines good visualization. And I sort of want to back up and ask, since I've mentioned him a couple times already, are you familiar with Edward Tufte? Some yes, some no. So he's sort of like the self-appointed father of modern data visualization, and like truth be told, there aren't actually that many competitors. In the late 1970s, when no one except for statisticians cared about visualization, at least how he tells the story is that he scoured yard sales and library deacquisition racks in order to construct the first comprehensive study of data visualization. And actually, I think secretly did a lot of really methodical research, but it's a good story to tell. His book was initially self-published, and now he holds these seminars when you can pay hundreds of dollars and be in his audience. I feel like this is a lesson for us all. In any case, his main point, wait, here I've got his slide, which he states in the first sentence of the first chapter of the visual display of quantitative information, is that graphics, quote, reveal data. Whereas what I argue is that visualizations are conceived in order to convey a specific view of the data, as well as an argument about the data. And I hope that each of the examples that I've just discussed brings this aspect of visualization to the fore. So what I want to do for the next few minutes, and here this is sort of the second section of my talk, is take you through my version of the history of visual display in order to show how the impulse towards visualization has in fact always been driven by this desire to present data in a particular way, and also a desire to convey an argument about the data contained therein. Critics often credit two men as the inventors of modern data visualization. They're Johann Lambert, who is a Swiss-German scientist and mathematician, and William Playfair, who is a Scottish political economist. And each of these men drawing inspiration from Enlightenment ideas about experiential knowledge, they sought to replicate what sort of we know as Newton's proof by experiments, right, in their respective fields. So this is the idea that if you could demonstrate something and observe it with your eyes, you could prove it to be true. This idea led to the emergence of a new form of scientific expression, and it was specifically a new visual form of scientific expression that could more effectively convey the factual nature of the phenomena observed. So, history of science types in the room, maybe? Anyone? We'll probably be familiar with Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaefer's landmark text from the 80s, right? Leviathan and the air pump. Some nods of recognition. Okay, which uses the example of Robert Boyle's air pump in order to make the case for the socially constructed nature of the scientific fact. So this is what it looks like. So among the points they make is that the air pump functioned as a symbol as much as it functioned as an actual discovery. So in point of fact, the air pump leaked, right? This was because the supposedly airtight filling was made of olive oil and some other vegetable juices boiled with lead. And they also had I think a method of filling the cracks with cheese curds. It was very strange. In any case, Shapin and Schaefer, they argue that the air pump only needed to be vacuum enough, right? It didn't need to work perfectly. People only needed to think that it worked perfectly. And in this way, they call it an emblem of its age, in part because it so deliberately mobilized these social conventions and also literary conventions about the idea of the experiment of the time. But there's also a physical dimension to it too, right? So if you think about the laboratory as an open scientific space where experiments could take place, the air pump is this concept in a microcosm, right? It's literally an enclosed space, an enclosed sphere filled with nothing into which you could put your experiments and see them performed. And I like thinking about the air pump in the context of data visualization because of the way it illustrates two of the major impulses that underlie visual display. One is this idea of the contained space, right? So the air pump is one, but the other is a single page, right? The all-in-one view. through which you can attempt to control your viewer's experience. And two, the way the scientific status of the experiments performed inside the air pump, the way that status rested so heavily on vision, right? Experiments acquired the status of scientific fact as a result of having seen them, or as a result of reading an account of someone else who had seen them. And I think also Boyle's experiment is a particularly apt example in the context of contemporary digital humanities debates, because I think, as many of you know, one of the earliest and most cited essays about DH is Tom Scheinfeldt's piece, Where's the Beef, or Does Digital Humanities Have to Answer Questions? A little hat tip to DH debates right there. And I know he came to talk to you last year, so maybe you already know that Scheinfeldt trained as a historian of science before he went on to his DH ventures. So in this essay, he cites Boyle's experiments, first with the air pump and then with static electricity, as evidence that new digital technologies and new digital methods, that they don't need to answer theoretical questions, at least not yet, right? That's what he says. He says, quote, only after decades of tool building, experimentation, and description were the tools, and here he's referring to Boyle's experiments, sufficiently articulated and phenomena sufficiently described for theoretical arguments to be fruitfully made. But what I think with the idea of the air pump as emblem, what this allows us to see is that Boyle was deploying the air pump in a theoretical manner from the start, right? If not to advance a specific argument about a scientific theory, then certainly as its own theoretical method of argument. And this deliberate attention to the method of presentation and to the uniform view that the presentation aimed to instill in its viewers is also plainly evident in contemporaneous examples of data visualization. The most famous image from this time is Joseph Priestley's New Chart of History from 1769, and it was actually, I don't know if you can read this, it was dedicated to Benjamin Franklin, himself a master of efficiency and also sort of a proto-quantified self type. I need to think more about that, I realize right now. In any case, this chart, it's not technically a data visualization, it's probably closer to InfoVis, but it was certainly the most influential. So people copied this chart all over the place. In the 19th century, the chart became an object of satire and fiction. And in the Library Company in Philadelphia, where I've done some archival research, they found copies of this chart tucked into 19th century books, so people consulted it for reference. So my training is in English, so I'm going to read at you a little bit. This is Priestley's explanation for how readers should view his chart. So, quote, if the reader carry his eye vertically, he will see the contemporary state of all the empires subsisting in the world at any particular time. He may observe which were then rising, which were flourishing, and which were upon the decline. Casting his eye a little on each side of the vertical line, he will see what empires had lately gone off the stage and which were about to come on. So, like Boyle, but here you get it a little bit more explicitly, Priestley anticipates the specific way he wants readers to perceive his chart. So, as the title of the chart indicates, a new chart of history, Priestley was deeply indebted to several earlier, albeit less famous, cartographers, and most closely a man named Thomas Jeffries. This is his chart of universal history, which you'll notice was published several years earlier. And I feel like this close connection between Priestley and Jeffries lends credence to the idea, which is sort of popular in the tech world today, right, that you don't need to do it first, you just need to do it better. So I like to think of Priestley as sort of like the Facebook of the 18th century, and Jeffries over here sort of like Friendster or something with like languages in the past, in any case. Priestley's chart was also indebted to another, there are many examples that you could choose. These are just a couple that I like talking about. Here's another early influence, the French pedagogue Nicolas Langlais de Fresnoy. He believed, this man, that there was a numerical limit to how many books a person could read in a lifetime. I think it was 1,200 books for an average person, and it got bumped up to 1,800 if you were a student. More than that, and you'd have to make a significant compromise in your memory and also comprehension. But if you stuck to that number, you'd be able to, quote, think a little bit about what you read. And there's more about him in Anthony Grafton and Daniel Rosenberg's book, Cartographies of Time, which is a really beautiful study of the history of the timeline. And so if these historical images are interesting to you, I recommend you head that way. In any case, Langlais, he advocated for the chart rather than the book for one of the same reasons today that people today argue for the strength of data visualization, so what's called cognitive enhancement. And I realize actually now that this is a terrible slide, so I don't even know if you can read it. In any case, so the visual display of information enhances pattern recognition, reduces search time, decreases processing resources. This is just a summary from Stuart Card's Readings and Information Visualization, which is sort of a canonical InfoVis textbook. And Card also is sort of a leader in the field of HCI almost from its beginning. Similar ideas also underpin the work of William Playfair, who I mentioned a few minutes ago as one of the fathers of modern data visualization. And he employed these painstakingly composed graphs and charts in order to advance his economic and political arguments about the British Empire. So for Playfair, charts were preferable to tables like the one that you saw earlier because they showed the shape of the data in a comparative perspective. So he explains this. On inspecting any of these charts attentively, a sufficiently distinct impression will be made to remain unimpaired for a considerable time, and the idea which does remain will be simple and complete. He's also responsible for the first pie chart, which he included in the Statistical Breviary, which was published in 1801. His 1786 Commercial and Political Atlas is also the source of the first bar chart. It's not actually this one. This one appeared a few years later. I just like this one more. In any case, Playfair, he saw the need for clear and accurate images at a time of political upheaval. And in the preface to the Commercial and Political Atlas, he explains, and here's a long quote of which I will read only a little, the minds of men, the boundaries of nations, their laws and relations with each other are all in a state of change. This goes on and he continues, quote, should those revolutions and partitions already effected or about to be attempted produce as usual political fermentation, Europe may probably be convulsed with war for 50 years to come. If it turns out so, a picture of the past will be a valuable thing. But if, on the contrary, commerce should continue its progress, this will make the first part of a great whole, which, when completed on some future day, will be a most valuable work. So, like Boyle when he started out, Playfair isn't entirely sure what purpose his images will serve, right? They'll function either as the testament to the end of an era or as a harbinger of a new world order. But in either case, he's confident that because of the, quote, form and manner that he's developed, that his charts will play some important role. And so then, also like Priestley, right, Playfair understands his method as much as the content contained therein as among his most significant innovations. And so, sure enough, less than 100 years later, we have residents of the United States, which was the nation that really compelled Playfair to create his revolutionary charts, devising their own visual methods to communicate all sorts of things. So like history, commerce, national mythology, a really astonishing range of information that I can talk about later. Here's a couple of examples of this. This is Emma Willard's Temple of Time, which was conceived as a sort of visual mnemonic to aid students in conceptualizing what had come to be called, following Priestley, universal history. So this improved upon Priestley's chart, which was familiar to her, and she wanted her chart to emphasize the viewer's position with respect to history. So history recedes in our minds, she thought, so it should also recede from sight. She explains this in the preface to the accompanying guide, which is this, which ran over 100 pages. And in the guide, she also claims that the Temple of Time provides, quote, service to the country. And I think with our knowledge that the country would soon be enmeshed in civil war, this is 1846, Willard's words, they take on weighty significance, right? So we can't really read statements like, here's a quote, she says, "We the people must have an enlightened will, or power with us may, like a steam engine on the wrong track, carry destruction in its course." So there's a sense of foreboding which she intuits, and we know in hindsight, that the fate of the nation rested on the accurate and accessible consumption of information. Hers is a political message, right? And it's conveyed through this metaphor of technology, the country like a steam engine on the wrong track. And so it's this metaphor of technology really only one step removed from the technology that she marshals to present her argument in visual form. And I'm not really sure, I can go back to this previous image. I don't know if you can see it. But so the Republic of America is this little yellow triangle here. So it's positioned front and center. It's poised to take over the visual field, but then also her perception is of the world itself. So the United States is literally coming at you. There are a lot of other interesting things to say about Willard and her role as a woman and an educator, and the ways in which her visualizations really sort of present some of the first interventions into sort of like feminist data visualization, and I didn't have time to talk about that today, but I can talk about that later. In any case, here's a, oh wait, that's that slide. Here's a second example. This is the Vine of Liberty from around that same time, which focuses exclusively on US history. So here you see visualized as intertwined plants, the parallel campaigns of the Northern, Central, and Southern armies during the Revolutionary War. And I don't know if you can read the scale on the image as you see it up here, but the yellow berries symbolize victories, the black berries symbolize defeat, and the gray ones, quote, defeated but not discouraged. So like Willard's Temple of Time, this one also came with a companion guide, and it provided written narratives of each of the battles. And I think as a further testament to Willard, even if it's not an acknowledged one, some of the paragraphs from this guide were directly copied from Willard's history book. So there's some more unacknowledged contributions of women. In any case, here's something I'm still researching. It's a diagram and statistical record of the signers of the Declaration of Independence that the American Antiquarian Society recently acquired, and where I was this past fall as a research fellow. So this was created in 1858. But like the previous chart, the Vine of Liberty, and actually for that matter, like Playfair's, it takes as its focus the Age of Revolutions. So over on the left, so this is a picture I took. It's the best one I have at the moment. I apologize for my arms are only so tall. So over on the very left of the page, you can see the signatures of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And then the lines that you see function as sort of a slope graph, so that they allow you to follow the relative ranking of that particular signer across many different kind of strange categories. The age at signing, the level of education, their marital status, their number of children, their number of surviving children, their age at death, and a couple more that are all indicated over on the key. Here you see a short article from a contemporaneous newspaper, the Davenport Daily Gazette from Davenport, Iowa, really praising the chart. And what's interesting in this, the small news item, is you see this rationale of utility, similar to the one articulated by Playfair. But here, the message conveyed as well as the method employed is also clear. So you have this coalescing, right, of both method and message. The author praises the diagram because it, quote, gives us almost at a glance an epitome of the lives of the immortal signers. And he calls it, quote, one of the most useful and patriotic maps ever issued. He says that in these, quote, piping times of war, every man should have one. And so here the diagram is useful because it's patriotic. And so in this way, this anonymous author gets at another important dimension of data visualization that InfoVis people today also describe visualization as a pathway to insight. So here's another image from data visualization textbook. So this is what Martin Wattenberg, who designed the wind map that I showed you earlier, what he calls the aha moment, or to bring it back to digital humanities, what Stephen Ramsey, he of the infamous "Do you have to code? I say yes" remark, kerfuffle thing. Anyway, what he identifies as the main benefit of visualization for literary criticism. What he says is that visualization, quote, forces us to see. And actually, the idea that a visualization can force a viewer to perceive information in a certain way, that's another idea, like this idea of the single view that has its origins in the 18th century. So you can see this a little bit in Boyle's conceptualization and presentation of his air pump, and also in the series of 19th century diagrams that I've just shown. But the most illustrative example, I think, comes not from any diagram of the United States or a chart of its history, but from the author of the Declaration of Independence himself. I can't get through a talk without mentioning Thomas Jefferson. You've been warned. Here it is. And so in the next part of my talk, I'm going to turn to some of my more applied research, which, as Matt really kindly quoted, earlier in his introduction, explores the history of data visualization in relation to issues of race. And it's also, Thomas Jefferson was one of the impetuses, which led me to develop my own strategy of employing this ordering, really insight-producing force of data visualization, employing this force sort of against itself. Scholars often point to the classification scheme that accompanied Jefferson's 1783 catalog of books as Jefferson's adherence to the Linnaean model of hierarchical relations. And to be sure, I think there's no clearer visual mode than a numbered, ordered list to convey hierarchy and rank, right? But there's a more subtle mode of enforcing that goes on in Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, in which he describes America as a land of inexhaustible resources and infinite sites for exploration. And in that work, Jefferson, he goes beyond description, presenting here, there's the title page, tables comparing the size of animals in Europe and North America, listings of indigenous American vegetables, and an extensive catalog of Virginia birds. These were supposed to overwhelm you with their abundance. And so in Jefferson's mind, and this is sort of the commonly agreed upon interpretation, the visual presentation of evidence aligned it most closely with his inductive methodology. So it bolstered his belief in the factual nature of what he had observed firsthand. And not coincidentally, the teacher who Jefferson credits for giving him, quote, "my first views of the expansion of science and of the system of things in which we are all placed," was a Scotsman, William Small, who taught Jefferson at the College of William and Mary, but then returned home to become the personal tutor of none other than William Playfair, whose visualizations you saw earlier. And I actually have more about this in the piece that Matt mentioned earlier. So as in Playfair's Atlas, the implications of the visual rhetoric of the notes, they extend from Jefferson's desire to assert the unequivocal nature of the evidence he's observed to his attempt to enforce a unanimity of response among his book's readers. And so I don't know how many of you are Americanists. I feel like at the grad center, you cannot take I would expect to have a few. But the argument is that, you know, in the shift from monarchical to democratic rule and when the country's citizens were delegated with the responsibility of, you know, choosing their officials, voting, making political decisions, the founders wanted to be absolutely sure that if they were given this power, they would also make the appropriate political decisions, right? You couldn't just turn over the power and let the people run willy-nilly. You had to sort of shape their views. And so in this graphical mode of presentation, so this is sort of how the argument goes, Jefferson promotes this new form of political control, sort of one that is enforced through this visual display. And this is arguably the specific context that gives rise to the explicitly nationalistic visualizations of the 19th century United States. Again, a time that the country's fate was at a crossroads, right? And the people had the ability to make decisions for themselves. How could we make the people see that the nation should be united, that it was going to continue on its course throughout history? We shall do so through this visual mode. But there is another form of political control, one far more insidious, that is enacted through Jefferson's notes. And this is through the racial hierarchies that he describes, but thankfully does not visualize, in the infamous Query 14. And if you've ever taken a survey of American literature, this is the one where Jefferson provides a ranking of racial groups. We actually get a starker representation of this in Jefferson's farm book. And this is a personal volume in which he records the names, birth dates, familial relationships, present locations, and then countries of origins of the men, women, and children he enslaved. So in this representation of information about the people who worked on his plantation, in the form of these lists and tables that really strongly resemble the other visual motifs that he'd used earlier, Jefferson, you see a different form of subjugation and control, which is the reduction of persons to objects and from stories to names. So in contrast to the data about plants and animals in the notes, or for that matter, the classification scheme for his library, this data about people, and specifically people who were enslaved, serves us a reminder of not just the politics, but also really the violence that can be enacted through visual display. So here's part of this a little bit closer. You can see an entry, Sally, 1773, which is, of course, Sally Hemings. And then also further on the list, Jemmy, 1765. I guess I don't have a slide of that one. Which referred to her older brother, James. And so James Hemings is a less well-known figure in Jefferson's life, but he had, as Sally, but he had an equally fraught personal history. So when Jefferson traveled to France to assume the position of minister to France, he took both Sally Hemings and James Hemings with him. And people think that this is where Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings began. And while that was happening, Jefferson had apprenticed James Hemings to the chef of a prince. He essentially enrolled him in French culinary school. And he learned to cook in the high French style. James Hemings, he learned to speak fluent French. His accent was reportedly much better than Jefferson's, and he could already read and write. And when he returned to the United States, he ended up negotiating with Jefferson for his freedom. And in this process, Jefferson insisted that Hemings train another person in, quote, the art of cookery before he could be freed. And so here you see this emancipation agreement. You can see the requirement that he train someone else before he can be freed formalized. So if you're up on your Jefferson trivia, you know that Jefferson was sort of a massive foodie. He sought out like, pasta from Italy, wine from France, ice cream from England, and this in spite of persistent financial troubles. And I have more to say about this elsewhere, but for now, you can sort of like take my word for it that Jefferson really understood food and eating as essential to this project of sort of instilling this uniform response in US citizens, right? How could citizens learn to cultivate appropriate political opinions and have sort of a uniform sense of culture? They could do so through reading, they could do so through looking at nature, they could also do so by eating in a particular way. So given the importance of food and eating to Jefferson's sort of cultural mission, it's not really a surprise that James Hemings, as his chef, should play a really crucial role. And so it was a big surprise to me when I began research on James Hemings, as I did actually for my dissertation, begun here. I went to the digital edition of the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, something like 30,000 documents. I typed a name search for James Hemings and I found no results. So I'm just going to go back to the Emancipation Agreement for a sec. This is how it appears in the digital edition, just because it's easier to read in this way. I just want to show how something like that can happen, right? So notice that the agreement is not authored, it's not written to James Hemings, right? It's just given this title by the archive's editors. And in fact, the document is witnessed over there on the left by Adrienne Petit, Jefferson's white maitre d'hotel, which is all to say that even though Hemings possessed skills so superlative that Jefferson required him to, in effect, trade his freedom for his culinary knowledge, even though he could read and write in 2 languages, because of his status as a slave, he was not a person to whom Jefferson ever wrote or from whom Jefferson ever received letters. So without prior knowledge of Hemings, also detailed metadata, and also advanced search tools. And I should actually say, Rotunda Press, which is the digital imprint of the University of Virginia Press, they actually do this better than others, so I don't mean to pick on them. But without information like this, right, metadata, advanced searching, prior knowledge, people like James Hemings and their stories, they become consigned to sort of like the lost realm of the archive, of sort of the pre-dark matter of the internet, right? Information that's there but that you can't get at without some way of knowing that it's there first. So in my project using the Jefferson papers, what I tried to do was restructure this archive. So here you see a visualization of the archive through which, rather than privileging the document's authors, I wanted to sort of dismantle the document as the unit of the archive. I wanted to look at each word of content on an equal plane. And I used this image, I created this image using ProtoViz, which is a JavaScript-based library for data visualization, which came out of Stanford. And it's since been supplanted by D3, which I'll talk more about later. So ProtoViz D3, they enable a range of formats for visualizing social network data, including the format that I've chosen, the arc diagram. And unlike the force-directed layouts that are more common with social network visualization, These are the ones that Alex Galloway and others have critiqued for all looking the same. Here I have an example. This is one that I made of my Facebook friends using Gephi. So unlike this form of network visualization, the arc diagram clearly identifies each individual, or what's called the node in the network, and also foregrounds the connections between those nodes, or what are called edges, through those arcs that you see that dominate the image. So here's another example of an arc diagram that I found recently. This is an arc diagram of the network of tweets between Congress people. So the blue are the Democrats and the red are the Republicans, and the arcs connecting them indicate that they've tweeted at each other. And so you can see generally more Republicans tweet than Democrats, and that both Republicans and Democrats mostly tweet to each other. That's sort of, and this is down at the bottom is the frequency of tweets. And guys, I'm going to go back to my image here. So in my visualization, as a single image, or to sort of borrow the language of Priestley, quote, sort of in one view, right? The overlapping arcs that comprise this visualization, they point to the multiple networks of power embedded in the Jefferson archive. So that's to say the complexity of the relations among individuals and across social groups. So the arcs that link Jefferson to the men and women he enslaved are much more prominent than those that link him to his family and friends, so indicating the degree to which Jefferson relied on these people to implement his various directives, right? Buying things, selling things, even telling them things. So even still, just like the archive, this visualization, it can't tell us what these people said in their conversations, where they went to conduct their transactions, or really how they truly lived their everyday lives. What this does instead is it really reframes the archive as a site of motion rather than one that's sort of static and fixed. And I think it challenges us as scholars to make the unrecorded stories that we detect and those that we might otherwise sort of pass over, right? Say, oh, there's nothing there. Instead, it really challenges us to make those stories expand with new meaning. So with this example and the others that I've shown today, I hope I've been able to convince you that visualizations can make arguments, that they can control, that they can resist, and that they can offer new perspectives altogether. Because I think this is what the most important thing is to understand about methods of visual display. And I think for as much as D.H. Evangelist would like to insist that the field revolutionizes not because it proposes an alternative to sort of the basic hermeneutical procedure, and I'm quoting Stephen Ramsey again from his newer book. So this is Ramsey. He says, the field revolutionizes not because it proposes an alternative to basic hermeneutical procedure, but because it reimagines that procedure at new scales, with new speeds, and among new sets of conditions. So contra that, I actually believe that the digital humanities does, in fact, offer new processes, so critical as well as technical, that allow alternative understandings of the archival record to unfold. And in my final minutes, I think what I want to do is just switch tacks a little bit in order to present some work in progress that's related, although not precisely aligned with the project I've just discussed. What you're seeing here is actually student work from a course about data that I taught last spring. And for this assignment, I asked students to take a historical visualization form and update it with contemporary data. And I also gave them the option of doing the reverse, taking the data from a historical visualization and updating the form. And the idea was to get students to think about what meaning was conveyed by the form of the visualization, and what meaning was conveyed also by the data itself. And so this student took, there's a famous map created by John Snow, the 19th century physician, where he mapped all of the cholera cases that were coming from a certain part of London, and by putting them on a map, he was able to target one particular water pump as the source of the cholera outbreak, and he would not have been able to see the clustering of the cases until he put them on a map. And this was actually some of the earliest evidence that led to sort of the decline of the theory that disease was passed through like foul air, and in fact was transmitted through water. So what my student did, and I'm going to go back to this now, was take the data of her debit card purchases and place them on a map of the Georgia Tech campus. By taking advantage of the geographic form, she was able to identify the places where she spent her money with the hope of becoming more aware of her spending habits throughout the day. And in creating this assignment, I was actually inspired by a trend that I've seen now that I've been paying attention to such things, that I've seen online that I'm not really sure if anyone has talked about, which is sort of all of these people who recreate historical data visualizations with contemporary software or with contemporary data. So for instance, here's William Playfair's bar chart recreated in Excel. And the creator, Jorge Camones, he says that he did this to, quote, pay humble tribute to Playfair, whose charts nevertheless, quote, always look better. But what he ends up discovering are some of the limitations of Excel, right? How it's difficult to display the area in blue in front of the columns, or how it's easier in Excel to create a larger form and then mask it by putting something over it in front. And this process of layering is crucial to the way that so many digital images are composed these days, I think, as anyone who's ever edited an image in Photoshop or Illustrator knows. And even now on the web, right, every image has an alpha value, which determines its opacity. And this is in contrast to earlier versions of making web pages where you arrange everything on a single layer, like in a grid, right? So similar to how examining the composition of Playfair's charts gets us thinking about printing and engraving, the technologies of their time, recreating his charts today calls attention to the structuring mechanisms of contemporary software. And people like Lev Manovich here and Tara McPherson have done really interesting work in this vein. And I think this particular synthesis of the historical and the contemporary and shifting between one and the other, I'm hoping will lead in a productive new way. Here's an example of the reverse, someone who's taken Playfair's line graph form and, as with my student, updated it with contemporary data. So in this case, it's contemporary US trade data. And the person who made it, Doug McCune, he's a professional visualization engineer. But what's interesting, I think, in this example is that even though he's created a fairly extensive app to display this data, I think he used Adobe Flex or something, it took presumably a fair amount of time to make the data display in this form. What he's most focused on when he talks about this project are the new stories that Playfair's format allows to unfold. So he finds visual evidence here of the exponential growth in trade to China, right? And he notes that it's cyclical. Here's one from Haiti, and you can see the impact of the coup that took place over there in the 90s. And here you see a new category called Advanced Technology Products, and how in 2002, so that's sort of the tail end of the first dot-com bust, the balance of trade in such project, it shifts from exports to imports, never again to recover. So he says on the blog post where he introduces this app, he says, I had fun creating the app, but one thing I didn't expect was how much fun researching the charts was going to be. The charts that stuck out with trends that were abnormal all had interesting stories to tell. And I think we're increasingly seeing an acknowledgement of this interplay between data and story, right? From the front page of the New York Times, which I talked about earlier, to data journalism programs like the one up at Columbia, to actual visualization software and libraries such as D3, which is sort of the technical thread that's running through this talk, which I perhaps could have amplified more. I think what's interesting is that, so the D3, the 3 Ds in D3 stand for data-driven documents, and the underlying assumption is that you start with the data and then you manipulate it into any number of visual forms. And it's really beautiful and it fills a real technical need, but I think as visualization becomes easier and more pervasive, we're only going to need more scholars and more students to expose the way that starting with the data, right, as they say, is in fact starting midway down the path. So this is a path, right, that's hewn with history and with culture by individuals and with nation. And I feel like it's up to us in this room and to programs like CUNY DHI to bring this story of data and data visualization to life. Thanks, that's all I have.